Hey, what's up? It's Dr. Nate, and today we start our third and final module that focuses on LGBTQ identities in the media. And today is 3.1, Queer Theory and Queer Media Analysis. So what is queer theory? Queer theory really springs from feminist theory and women's studies. It is just this vast array and a vast collection of different types of work by different queer academics that are looking at disrupting the normative flow of just socially constructed ideas. Now, we talked about hegemony, we talked about patriarchy. So what queer theory does is it takes all these socially constructed notions of what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's normal, and it disrupts them. And that includes sexuality and gender specifically. We also look at power, where power comes from, how power is disseminated, and how do we look at which notions of hegemony and patriarchy are considered normative, right? What is normal? And how do we take that and then look at these other sexualities that are sometimes considered deviant? So then it looks at how people perform gender, how people perform different types of sexual orientations, how are they depicted, what are the narratives that are being told about them, and how are they presented as normative and as deviant. So we can look at traditionally heterosexuality, one man, one woman, having children, being Christian is being considered normative. So anything that exists outside of that then is considered deviant. And because of that, queer theory is able to look at it, deconstruct it, disrupt it, and see what is being presented. Also, much like feminist theory, queer theory looks at media and other forms of content that is created by queer individuals and consumed by queer individuals. Now, we have a long history of different types of queer content and a long history, not just in the United States, but around the world, where anything that was considered along the LGBTQ spectrum was considered sexually deviant, right? And because of that, different types of content could not be created that focused or that was targeted specifically to LGBTQ individuals. And so because of that, a lot of these things were hidden and there were different types of content that gave this textual wink to people that were queer. And we'll talk about that more specifically here in a second. So we also look at queer theory as a space to investigate different types of identities that are along the LGBTQ spectrum, not just in terms of sexual orientation, but also in terms of gender performance, and how all of that is central to identity. How we use mediated content specifically to construct our queer identity, and also how queer identities are being presented or misrepresented or completely symbolically annihilated in media as well. This is central to not just identity, but also politics, right? Especially now in the post-2016 socio-political atmosphere, anything that is considered deviant, right, that is queer, is very much a political statement, and it is being, I would say under attack, but is definitely being scrutinized in a lot of the different laws that are being passed, right? To queer is also something that we say is to disrupt. So when we look at queering something, right, using the word queer as a verb, we're disrupting a pattern. So we can take something that might be considered a normative performance. Let's say we're going to look at Gone with the Wind, and we can queer it, right? We can make a play or a movie that has the same storyline, but with queer characters. Or we can look at something like a advertisement where that is traditionally a man and a woman, and add queer people to it and then queer that, right? We're disrupting it. We're making it not just along the normative gender or patriarchal binaries. We disrupt it in terms of sexual orientation and as well as in terms of gender as well. And we'll take a look at a couple of examples here in just a second as well. Some of the prominent academics that have worked in queer theory include Eve Sedgwick, Judith Butler, Lee Edelman, Lauren Beriant, and Leo Bersani, and the list goes on and on and on. So because there have been so many different people that are looking at queer theory, there is not just one specific way in which we can define queer theory. It is basically looking at the act of being queer along that LGBTQ spectrum. But of course, it's not without its criticism. A lot of people criticize queer theory for looking at a very monolithic identity, specifically just the gender performance or just the sexual orientation, and not really being intersectional, right? Looking at the intersection of sexual orientation with religion, with race and ethnicity, with socioeconomic status, with disability and ability. And so there are some academics that are looking at intersecting identities with LGBTQ identities, such as Jasper Puar, James Garcia, who has come up with this theory of multiplicity, and E.P. Johnson, queer theory. And queer theory specifically looks at sexual orientation with race, ethnicity, and social economic status. And we'll have another module that looks entirely at queer theory, so we'll save that for later on in the semester. Something to also think about is this sexual othering, right? Why did we need queer theory? Where does queer theory arise from? So just like feminist theory, right? It was this kind of very monolithic male, straight, cisgender male look at mediated content. And when we think about sexual othering, it's when we favor this heterosexual category and reinforce the idea that this is what is normal. This is how things should be. And so media content, specifically everything that was pre-1990, really had a very heteronormative look to it, right? One man, one woman, matrimony, that's when they had sex, and it was for procreation only. So everything outside of that was othered, and it was this sexual othering. We have academics that have been working on how this sexual othering affected not just the socially constructed notions of what it was to be normative, but also mediated content, right? So Michael Foucault looks at this discursive construction, how people use rhetoric and talk to be able to construct what is normative and what is deviant. Judith Butler looks at gender performativity. We talked about this in the last module, how not only do we come to identify what is gender and what are traditional gender roles, but how we use that in turn to perform these gender identities. And then Jenkins and Tashville and Turner have this concept of social identity, right? How do we then act out different identities, whether it's the personal identity that we feel or the group identity that we belong to? So if we feel like we're part of the queer community, then how do we perform that identity when in the presence of other queer individuals? But then how do we perform that identity when we're in the presence of other individuals, maybe who are not queer, right? So this kind of back and forth negotiation of identity in different spaces. It all comes down to how we feel as individuals and what the media is telling us should be the normative ways of not just presenting identity, but also performing it, right? And then how do we look at content that is created by queer people for queer people and analyzing that as well? There's a lot of sexual stereotypes that exist in media when it comes to people who are LGBTQ. There is this dichotomy of how people are presented when we look at LGBTQ versus non-LGBTQ. So there's that natural versus deviant that we've been talking about. Queer characters in the media are identified as deviant simply because the characters are not portrayed as these typical heterosexual individuals. We also see camp is also something that was created and utilized by the queer community, specifically queer individuals of color. And you may have heard camp being thrown around here recently in the last couple of months because the latest theme for the Met Gala was camp. So what is camp? Camp is like this cultural aesthetic style, and it's based on this very deliberate, right? These are two key words, deliberate and self-acknowledged theatricality that is commonly associated with and tied to queer queer characteristics. Camp is used creatively to combat and cope with living in this very heteronormative society. It brings people together, especially those that are in the queer community, through different shared interests and experiences. And usually it's kind of over the top, larger than life, lots of colors, lots of laughs. It's camp and comedy. Some examples that I can think of are Rocky Horror Picture Show, Rent, and Kinky Boots, right? Usually there's some song, there's some dance, and always elaborate costumes. Another thing that we look at in media when it has to do with LGBTQ is this fourth persona. And that's when the creator of this media content creates text or maybe messages within the visual representation that only certain audience members will pick up on, right? This happens because the message is directed to that said audience members and only they will pick it up. So certain words, right? So if we use words like hunty, words like shade, words like tea, right? That only queer audiences might pick up on, then that is an example of the fourth persona. Now, a lot of queer content has gone mainstream. One huge example is RuPaul's Drag Race. And so now a lot of people who are not part of the LGBTQ community still know what this kind of what we call the textual wink is. And so they still know that even though it's directed to the queer community, they still understand what it means. The textual wink is just the actual manifestation of this fourth persona in the actual mediated text itself. It could be spoken, it could be written, or it could be just something that is visually presented. I want to give an example really quick of this fourth persona in SpongeBob SquarePants.
I think you'd be more comfortable over at that place.
Weenie Hut Juniors? Are you saying I belong in Weenie Hut Juniors?
Oh no, sorry. I was actually pointing at the place next to it.
Super Weenie Hut Juniors?
Yes. Unless you think you're tough enough to fight me.
So of course, when we think about Weenie Hut Juniors and the idea of weenie being something that represents the penis, right? Children who are watching this are not going to automatically get the reference. But then we see right here what the Weenie Hut, Super Weenie Hut Junior looks like. There's rainbows, there's unicorns. It's very, very queer, right? It's very gay. So somebody looking at this who may not be part of the queer community or someone who's a child may not automatically associate this with something that is LGBTQ or gay. But for those individuals who are part of the queer community, they definitely get it. Something else that happens in academia is called the queer media analysis. And that's where we look at a piece of content, media content, sometimes referred to as media text, and we look at how it is being represented, how the content itself can be queer. And this can take on two different types of formats. One is actually looking at content created by queers for queers. So we might be analyzing Queer Eye, which you're going to be doing, or we might be looking at something that was created specifically for gay people, or we could be looking at something that is created for a general audience, like SpongeBob or Tarzan or anything else, and how that is has these subtle nuances and textual winks that are directed towards LGBTQ individuals. So it's this kind of interdisciplinary perspective that disrupts socially constructed systems of meaning surrounding human sexuality. We can find that anywhere. We can find it in films, television series, music, and we look at how traditionally here in the United States and kind of America, we follow this very strict binary system of sexuality and gender, right? One man, one woman, heterosexual versus homosexual. And then what patriarchy and hegemony kind of plays a role in these socially constructed norms. And we look at how we disrupt that, right? It happens a lot in pop culture. So we reject this, what we would call maybe this arbitrary normalcy, this patriarchy, this gender dichotomy, and how we instead work to make it strange, to frustrate, to counteract, to delegitimize, and to camp it up, according to Sullivan. It's this intermediacy, this unstable, this non-fixed refusal to assimilate, right? And so a lot of individuals, maybe because of the company they work for or the time and space, remember when we're looking at analyses of media, we have to consider time and space. They may not be able to be fully queer, so instead they use subtle hints, these textual winks, or maybe they just purposely create it, but not a lot of people get what is happening. So when we do a queer media analysis, we can either look at queer content created by queer producers, or we look at mainstream pop culture content and see what notions of it might be LGBTQ or might be considered queer. queer. So I can take an example of Tarzan, and this is going to be the animated series that happened through Disney. Posner did this analysis back in 2015, which is a queer media analysis, and they looked at how Tarzan could be queer. So Tarzan himself is removed from human civilization and grew up with no concept of gender norms, right? Just this abstract kind of notion of to survive. Disney depicts him though as heterosexual. So when you look at the cartoon, if you haven't looked at it, spoiler alert, but I'm sure everybody has a notion of what Tarzan is, right? Tarzan is depicted in these very heterosexual terms. Tarzan has a couple of friends that we meet along the way in the movie. Turk is one of them, and Turk is the gorilla who is female despite a lot of her actions. She has a lot of masculine traits. She's strong. She has a lot of brave concepts that are typically associated with masculinity that we've talked about in previous modules. And then we have Tantor, which is the elephant. Tantor is male despite a lot of the actions that might characterize him as female, only because of the traditional gender roles that we have and what is typically assigned to femininity. So Tantor is afraid of confrontation, doesn't really like to do a lot of action, portrayed as weak and ineffective, what has traditionally been presented to us in media content as being feminine. Now, both Turk and Tantor do not fit the gender binary, right? Perhaps not strictly heterosexual, but they're seen in this very campy style, right? It's comedic. It's supposed to be camp. And because of that, right, we can see that this might be considered queer. Then we have Saber, who is the bad guy in the movie. And Saber is kind of presented as a sexual deviant, right? He's sexy. His voice is something that is also very ambiguous. Is it a male? Is it female? The way Saber moves throughout the cartoon. He has a very feminine body, and it's evil because he's not clearly heterosexual, and because of that he is presented as this deviant. He's othered and he's ostracized by the other animals, and he kills hetero humans and gorilla couples, and at the end he's killed by Tarzan. And this can be read as this kind of Tarzan coming to terms with him being a man, right, human, but still being a man, and conquering this ambiguous homosexual type of nature. So in the end, Tarzan kills Saber, wins, and the hetero triumphs, and the white heterosexual male savior comes to the day. So this is a way of looking at Tarzan, right? So in the end, humans teach and show Tarzan how to be human, how to be heterosexual, right? Because he meets the girl. Tarzan is transformed. He used to be free of all human restraint, including sexuality, but now he's positioned there because of socially constructed notions, right? Even though he's clearly heterosexual, there are very heterosexual male traits that are assigned to Tarzan at the end. He's masculine, he's brave, and he defeats the sexual deviant. And he knows all of this only because the humans taught him and told him. Again, symbolic interactionism, socially constructed ideas of what patriarchy, hegemony, and these gender norms are supposed to be, right? So Tarzan is a really great example. There's a couple of videos that I have put up for you in this module that I want you to watch. The first one is the new video by Taylor Swift that just came out a couple of days ago. It's called You Need to Calm Down. Here are a couple of stills from the video itself, and she is using camp to the extreme, and the song itself is directed towards people who are very critical or against the LGBTQ community. And so in it, she includes a lot of camp, but also a lot of LGBTQ references and individuals, symbols, right, like the rainbow. She also includes a lot of the drag queens from RuPaul's Drag Race's latest season, also Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. The entire cast is in it. She makes up with Katy Perry in this very campy way. Again, Katy Perry, if you remember, to the Met Gala wore this hamburger costume, and then Taylor Swift dresses up like French fries and then kind of squashes the beef, pun intended, because the two kind of had been fighting back and forth. They were best friends, then they weren't. Now they're back to being best friends again. So I want you to take a look at the video and see how something like this can be camp. It can be created by a non-LGBTQ person as an advocate, right? But still speak to the LGBTQ community. So watch this video, please. Another one is Eugene Lee Yang. He has come out as gay in a music video, and the music is being performed by the band Odessa. And there is absolutely no spoken words, no lyrics in the music video. It's strictly music by Odessa and Eugene Lee Yang dancing and performing in this very gender non-binary, sexually ambiguous way. And through the performance, he really does tackle a lot of the stereotypes that come along with being gay, but he also kind of bends gender here and there. He also does some performances that talk about church and religion and how that is viewed, or how that institution views being LGBTQ. His very strict Asian family and how they accepted and some didn't accept him being gay. So I think this is a really good example, not just of queering or LGBTQ content, but also at symbolic interactionism, right? And how you can look at something that has absolutely no words and know exactly what they're talking about. So please take a look at this video as well.